Today's topic, Mark will join us in flight. How to be a good content owner. This came from our last session, if you were here 2 weeks ago, about how to wrangle content owners, because wrangling content owners and content usually the number one schedule risk for us on any project. How do we convince and compel people to do that well? Watch the recording for that. This will be from the content owner point of view. So if you're wrangling content owners in your role, dear audience, there's probably some tidbits in here you can feed to them. If you are a content owner and own and manage and curate content for a site or sites, we hope you find this useful. So I think you know us pretty well, the different perspectives that we bring. Here's what we'll talk. We just talked Genesis. We'll talk about why it matters, a bit about the role and some resources to help you manage content. So we talked about it. Top challenge. Ownership a lot of times is unclear, especially in dynamic organizations where you've got mergers, acquisitions. I used to own this site. Someone used to own this site. I inherited it. I don't know what's on it, etc. And definitely a lack of content lifecycle management. Probably 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 clients who we talk to when you ask, hey, do you have a records retention policy in place that you enforce and you govern and you work with? About 1 in 5 probably say yes. And again, that's just a maturity question and a size and scale and complexity and compliance question. A lot of times.
And some of them are lying. I would be surprised if it really was 1 in 5.
Yeah. Hi, Mark. Yeah, like, hey, we have this. Yeah, we have it right here. It's in this
binder
on the bookcase behind me.
Nailed.
Right?
Yeah. Jimmy's in charge of that. Does a great job. Yeah.
It's right next to our governance plan for SharePoint. All right. So a little bit about why it matters. Maybe I'll shut up and other folks on the team can talk about why good content stewardship matters.
Well, I think
I just got here, so I don't know if it's time for me to jump in or not.
Oh, it is, Mark. It is.
Can I get anybody some coffee or some other stimulant?
Yeah, cappuccino, please.
Okay.
Light in the foam.
So content ownership is a never-ending job, right? I mean, it's not something where you write up a memo and you send it out and then you forget about it for the rest of the time. Anybody remember memos? So organizations are never static. You know, they reorganize all the time. The business focus changes, the strategy changes. So you know you need to be able to adapt your content to those changes. Content becomes obsolete. You know, the document that outlines this year's health plan is not correct next year because it's not the same health plan anymore. Search exposes everything that you've put out there that isn't permissioned in some way to preclude it. So if you've got the old 2007 health plan piece of content sitting out there and people search for health plan, they're going to find that. And they may well not know that it's not the right one. Gee, that seems cheap. I'm going to go for that.
Hey, Mark, one I think in my experience is by far the most important one because people consistently say search sucks in SharePoint. I can never find what I'm looking for. And then when we dig in and peel back the covers, it's not a search issue. It's a content management issue.
Exactly. Yeah. You have to realize that it's just like the internet. Anything you put out there in Facebook or Twitter or whatever is there forever unless you delete it. And then even then it's there for a while. So you have to think about that internally as well. And the fourth bullet is about that. You know, it erodes trust if you have a bunch of out of date content. You know, if you're in HR and you've got all those old health plans lying around and nobody can tell the difference, then nobody believes that you're providing them information that they need. And guess what? They call you every time they have a question because they don't trust the content that you put out there. You can have support nightmares. You know, people can say, "Oh, no problem. I'll help you with that." And they search and they find stuff that is actually wrong. You know, just go into the system and hit this button and delete those 12 items. It's like, oh, you just screwed up the system.
I'd like to add to that out of date content also erodes interest. Like if I go someplace and I see something, the vacation schedule that I know is wrong, or it erodes trust, but I just quit being interested in going to SharePoint or going to the portal or whatever it is, because I just know that it's easier to go someplace else, and it doesn't build that muscle memory of that's the place I go when I do work and when I look for stuff. So I think it goes a little deeper than to just trust even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you have an intranet that has only old or crappy content, people just don't use it. Yeah. So as a content owner, you're responsible for the fact that people are not using the investment that you put out there.
Or lorem ipsum or to be determined content as well.
I've seen construction, under construction, right?
I've seen a lot of that, especially with sort of larger redesigns where folks want to launch something and put the content in later. And, you know, if it's not there to begin with, you're losing out on your opportunity.
Yeah. Anything somebody says they're going to do later, they probably will never do.
Exactly.
I have a teenage son. I know how this works.
You know, one thing we don't have on this list for why it matters is that reworks are expensive. And I've run into this as a platform owner and supporting our clients. You spend all the time and investment to, let's say, implement an intranet. A year or two goes by, no one kept the content up to date. Now you have to do an entire project again to re-implement the intranet. And then you also have to invest in additional change management for all that trust that you lost in the past year and a half when people couldn't find what they needed.
We don't mind that, but we don't recommend that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that exposes a bigger thing that just we follow with everything is maintenance of anything just isn't sexy. But maintenance is the thing that makes everything work. And if you don't do maintenance, then like, you know, a year and a half later, your car doesn't run and or whatever. But yeah, you're right that this, if you let this get out of date, not only do people lose interest, but yeah, you end up having this huge problem. You got to bring folks like us in to fix it.
Same with code. Same with code.
Yeah. That's something that I think is painful, especially for those of us that's in praxis. When we hear people say SharePoint sucks, and it's really that the content sucks, and we've already talked about that a little bit. So then somebody moves to another platform or they choose another technology. Great, no problem, and the content still sucks, and they still have a user community that's pissed off. So you can't solve the problem with the technology. You have to solve the problem with the content. That feedback one is really important too. I mean, we say to people all the time, you know, well, we want your feedback. Please let us know how to make this better. And then people never react to those suggestions. You know, if you're going to collect suggestions, you've got to do something about it. And the best way to do something about it is to be very transparent about what feedback you're getting, what changes you're making. You know, that's a great news post. We just, you know, we've heard from many of you that this wasn't working that well. We've rewritten this set of content. Please take a look and let us know, because that way people feel like they're an active part of the whole process, and that if they think something's not working well, you'll actually help them fix it.
That's an awesome use of news, especially if that news feed is coming into the places where they're now surfacing news. I mean, that is a big stride that the platform has made recently, is to bring news to the users better and more cleanly. And so if you're then using that to help inform your consumers of your content, that the content has been updated, that can be really powerful to fix the trust issue, probably.
If I could address Melissa's comment in there about the ownership of the intranet is only in parts and it's not overall. We have in the queue for a future Asks and Praxis an intranet steering committee session to talk about how to form one, why you should, who should be on it, how it should work, what it should be responsible for as well. So Melissa, that lack of clear ownership, I think we'll be talking about that in the future. I think we'll be talking about that in a much more specific way today about content. I think we all agree on why this matters, on why content matters. Can we start talking about the role of it? Or Todd, is there one more point you wanted to make there?
Yeah, I thought you were going to mention Melissa's comment that this was a great topic, and I agree, Melissa.
Thank you for your valuable input as always.
Yes.
Let's talk about the role. What do content owners? We a lot of times when we present clients with options for designs, we talk about good, better, best. Let's talk about what good content owners know. We can even talk about it in good, better, best in terms of a maturity model as well. I know there's a maturity model angle here. Who wants to talk about the composition of a good content owner?
I'm happy to dive in. So I think as a content owner, the title itself is really clear that you should know what content you're responsible for. And it's very important to know those edges of what your lead on, what someone else's lead on, and how those two things connect or do not. Because again, you want to make sure you have that one source of truth in your intranet. So a great example I run into all the time will be human resources wants to surface payroll information on their site. Well, finance owns payroll. Yes, people go to human resources to find payroll information because they see that as one of their benefits of employment, but we should really be directing them to the other content owner, which is finance, for that information if they come to us. Some of these are definitely aspirational. I think one of the biggest conversations I have with our clients is around which format is best for each type of your content. And this spans things from Word documents, SharePoint pages, SharePoint lists, SharePoint news. It really depends on the use case of how and when people are consuming this information and what they're going to do with it. For example, if it never needs to be printed out, then I would argue there's likely not a use case for a Word document on your communication site. A good content owner should also know what information should be shared within the organization. So there may be existing content that they own, but there also might be content gaps that they need to contribute to and fill out. And when you're making all of this content, you really need to be aware of how people are consuming it. So people read on the web very differently. So you should be structuring your content to support how they're going to read it and consume it in the situations that they're in.
If only there were a way for people to understand how to write content for the web.
Well, you're teasing our next slides, you know. Well,
SharePoint, Krista. We see this all the time. About when we ask for content for pages, a lot of times we get back a folder full of PDFs.
Yeah, or as we're designing pages, people don't like it because it doesn't look like the printed page or it doesn't act like the printed page. And to Emily's point, if it's not going to be printed out, let's take advantage of the platform.
Yeah. Forms in Excel, all kinds of weird stuff that happens, screenshots in Word. I mean, just all kinds of different ways of building content that's exactly the wrong tool.
Yeah.
So go ahead, then.
Good content owners also need to know, I think the what is a lot of what we're framing out in the implementation, but then there is that full content lifecycle that we started to touch on in our previous two sessions. We need to know if there's a strategic change in your organization, how that impacts your content. You need to be reviewing it on a recurring basis because as we've called out, your organization is continually changing. You also need to be listening to that feedback. So make sure you're providing that additional content, clarifying that content as your colleagues and employees are reaching out to you. And then you also need to know when that content is in another system so you're not replicating it in SharePoint and creating dual content areas.
Yeah, I want to go back and talk about the review bit. For me, so I don't create content much, and I don't work as much like with Emily and Mark. They work with the people that create content. I don't do that as much. But for me, when we were talking about this session, the reviewing content and keeping it up to date, that was the part that really spoke to me. And I think that's the piece that I feel doesn't happen enough on the web and in SharePoint and all that is when content is out there, it's not like you can publish it and forget it. Once you put it out there, Emily likes to talk a lot about how, links are promises and all that. I feel like publishing something to your intranet is a promise, and the promise is that information will always be correct. And so when you publish something, you have to review it because, again, we've got the trust issue and the interest issue. And I'm a big fan. I don't remember how SharePoint does it, but like having the date, because I'm thinking about like blog posts and stuff, but having the date that it was published and keeping that stuff current does, I think, man, as a consumer, that's one of the most important pieces of this.
This kind of loops back to Melissa's point earlier about ownership of the intranet, because Emily, I know we talked about it, you as a platform owner, I as a platform owner for a large intranet would be the one to be like, hey, some things have changed in the organization. I got this email announcement and then I went to the HR site and I don't see anything about it there, or I see something that conflicts with it directly. So as the platform owners, we were the ones going back to content owners to kind of prompt that update. I think it's a luxury to have that role in a lot of organizations, but how do we help content owners be more proactive in that way?
there's certainly ways to automate that kind of thing. I mean, it's an extensibility case, but you certainly can have low level, automation to try to help inform content owners, if you know who they are, about stale content. And you certainly can do it with probably flows and such, but there's other ways to attack that. And I think it's an interesting thing that we could start thinking about doing. It's ironic too, because the thing that's coming into my head is the conversation that we're seeing on Twitter right now around the site property bag that has not been deprecated in any way, shape, or form. I don't want to freak anybody out, but the site property bag hasn't been modernized in quite a while, and it becomes a very powerful tool to assigning information about a site. And one of those things certainly could be who's the content owner of this site, not because you have the sort of owners group, which is not necessarily the content owner. I mean, one of those people probably is, but it's not necessarily the same person or the person who needs to be notified.
And I would argue in most use cases, of course, it always depends, but majority of our clients use SharePoint News. And if there's a strategic change, probably should have been shared via SharePoint News. So that's issue one, right? If we have a separate email, it's not even in your intranet. And if you get into the habit of being a content owner, sharing these strategic information in the intranet, hopefully that also leads you to realize while you're already there, hey, this also has this impact to my other content that I need to begin editing.
It's a great point, Julie. I think what you're talking about speaks to some of what we were writing for a site catalog, so we could flag sites that hadn't been updated in 3 months. This was a site governance question, but it comes back to the content that's on that site. Hey, nothing's been updated on this site in 3 months. Do you still need it?
Right.
That's a pretty draconian approach to governance. It might not be 3 months. It might be a year. No one's touched this site in a year, but we could do the same thing with content to help us keep it clean.
Right. It doesn't have to necessarily be, do you still need the site? It's more like, hey, I just want to let you know some of the content on this site is more than 2 years old since it's been touched.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time you took a quick gander.
Yeah, I don't know that tyGraph, I can't remember whether tyGraph has good out of the box content analytics that would show me, a pie chart of more, 3 months or younger, 3 to 6 months, 6 months to a year, greater than a year in terms of age of content. But that's a rich vein to mine, I think, at some point.
Yep.
ShareGate, I mean, mentioning a couple of vendors, there are vendors who add, a layer on the outside of things. ShareGate will tell you what sites you have that are inactive, and you can define, you have some ways to define what inactive means. But you haven't updated any content in 6 months. Geez,
right.
That's probably not a thing, right?
Yep. Yeah, some basic content health analytics, right, that some of our partners would provide. Emily, is there anything else we wanted to cover on this slide, or do we want to go to what Mark was teasing and just saying, hey, what are the resources we have to help content owners know and do these things?
I think just to call out that part of content ownership is also supporting other content owners and making sure that you are a resource to your colleagues who are sharing this same role, and making sure that you share best practices with them and tips and tricks and answer their questions, because one site being out of date does impact your very up-to-date site and the overall trust of the intranet. So it's in your best interest as a content owner for, let's say, HR, to also make sure that you're supporting finance as well the best way you can.
Or one site that's brilliant but doesn't follow the patterns of all the other sites.
Sure.
Not a great experience.
There are pictures of your cat. Why are there pictures of your cat?
All right, so here's some of the things.
Cat?
It's getting out of the property bag.
Cat's in the property bag.
Letting the cat out of the property bag, exactly.
Well played. So here's some of the things we can provide, we can do to help content owners do the things we're asking them to do and support them in that.
One of the biggest things I see being impactful is clear roles and responsibilities. And if just for a quick second, you go to the next slide, Mike, I have an example of what we had at a previous organization where I was a platform owner, where we called out what the SharePoint admins were responsible for. So that was the IT side. We also later had a communications department, so they were responsible for look and feel. That's not necessarily reflected here. But you can see that we're calling out what site owners are responsible for and site members are responsible for. Not only do you need to call that out for the intranet, I strongly recommend, if you're going to designate someone in a department as a content owner, add it to their job responsibilities as well. Because if they're going to be measured on it, it's tied to their bonus, it's tied to their job description. They're going to have so much more support to spend all of that time doing the good content ownership that you're asking for.
This is a great little takeaway right here. Just for people who want to crib this into their governance plan, this is a nice.
It's amazing though how many organizations just have never defined any of that, and so therefore, I think the admins do that, but I'm not sure. In other words, everything falls on the floor. Everything.
Yep.
I think that's often the case, though. Like, oh, sorry, Derek. Okay. I was just going to say, the only thing I'm going to say is I think that's often the case, right? They look at the SharePoint site and its management as not the role of everyone in the organization. It's just like this extra thing. And so then, of course, the extra thing never gets done. Sorry, go ahead, D.
Yeah. How do we end up in a spot where, like in that diagram where we have site owners, plural, as monitoring the content and content ownership? How do we ensure, what are some best practices for making sure that, like, it's not just one person, or that it's diffused across every, 2 or 3 people and they're all not going like this?
That's fair. I especially run in, I'm hanging heavy on the human resources example today, but that tends to be one of the largest content areas on an intranet. And then there are usually really specific roles within HR as well, where you have learning and development, you have benefits administration, maybe then you have someone who's supporting some of the training for managers specifically. I think it's really important at the beginning of the project when you're making the site to clearly call out which content areas each person's responsible for. And to Derek's point, I think there should always be an S on site owner, because what if I'm on vacation? The organization can't stop because I went to Iceland to visit Derek. We're going to need to have someone update that content on the site for sure.
Actually, when you go to visit Iceland, everything does stop.
I was just going to say,
well, I was
we'll
just
all
saying,
be stopping them.
Because we'll all be there because we'll be jealous. So yeah, who would?
We'll have FOMO.
And Em, I think it's a great point too. Like, the size and complexity of the organization has a lot to do with this. Like, if for large intranets, it's usually communication professionals who are business partners to the business, the department or function, et cetera, but they have a communications background. It's explicitly part of their job, as opposed to smaller organizations where, like, I'm the head of HR and I have to learn how to publish content in SharePoint because there's not a comms pro to do it for me. Huge range of variance there. And poor Microsoft has to develop one tool that works for everybody, under all those models.
They can do it.
Anything else we want to talk about tools wise?
I think we have some obvious ones, so I'm going to skip over like training and documentation. Champions community really just refers to this idea that we want to make sure all the site owners can connect with each other, and we give them a platform for that. So that might look like a team site where they all have access connected to Microsoft Teams so they can share better practices. Maybe there's a monthly meeting where you're sharing updates and what's coming on the roadmap and how it'll impact them as well. One that I've seen work really well in organizations that are launching Microsoft 365 for the first time is to take really specific use cases and highlight them, whether it be a town hall meeting, your company newsletter, SharePoint news, making sure you say, hey, for example, this HR team spent a lot of time transitioning all of the benefits information over from a file share into the intranet with this cool filter and all this stuff. Look how much easier it is for you to find the content, because then it's celebrating them, which is well-deserved, but then it's also inspiring other people in the organization to apply the same tactics to maybe get the same ROI, or even because they want to be highlighted and that's their incentive.
Yeah, I want to jump back.
Go ahead, Todd.
Jump back to the champions one. That one is the admin, is the token admin in the group. I find that one to be one of the most powerful tools that I've ever used. And way back a long time ago when I was a SharePoint admin, my boss made me do this. And he's like, you need to come up with this champions call. You need to get people from the different business units, accounting, R&D, and all that, bring them together and have them talk amongst themselves about how they're using SharePoint. You don't get to talk. they get to talk and they get to compare notes with each other. And I hated the idea. All of you that know me know that that hurt my heart to not be able to talk. But it was great content because they were all trying to do the same kind of things, but from different angles, and they were able to learn off of each other. And as an admin, I don't use SharePoint much, so I don't feel the same pains. And so it was great for me to hear the things they were working around and the things that they were doing. And, like you said, with the case studies, then it also gave them a chance to brag a little about what they'd done. They get a little sense of ownership in the platform. So now you've got some people in the field to help you when you've got a problem. The champions bit, I can't emphasize that enough. I think that's a great resource.
I just wrote in the chat, would we tend to want to see that community be closed, meaning a team to which only members have access, or open, which is more often a Yammer community, or a public team, but they're used a lot less frequently, I would say.
When I
would
did
say
it,
yes.
Vitally, it was private.
I think there's a lot of value. We do this with almost every client now. A lot of value to having the site owners be part of a team, and that gives them the ability to admit they don't know how to do something to each other, hopefully, and actually support each other. I would say we probably have a 50-50 success rate on that at most, because while we're building the sites, everybody's involved, and then they think their job's over, but their job is only just beginning. So if as the owner of that site owner's team, you need to keep it moving. What Todd was talking about doing, and I think that more closed community is really valuable. And then you could have a Yammer community for everyone who uses the intranet. Maybe that's your feedback mechanism. Maybe that's where you get your next great ideas.
This may be not something that everybody agrees with, but I might argue that often if you have a choice of two people to be a content owner, I would take the person who's enthusiastic about tech and somebody who wants to learn over the person who knows the most about the content that has to be there. Because if the person who knows the most about the content that has to be written has zero interest in being on the platform, you're not going to get as far as if you had somebody who's super excited about the platform and can then maybe go drag the information out of someone.
Yeah, I mean, you see in certain industries, it's the site owner, the initial list of site owners is all VPs.
Yeah, that's like, essentially what I'm getting at. Yes.
Nope, that's the wrong person.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's somebody you would never expect who really shines at that. It could be, an executive assistant. It could be somebody in the mailroom. It doesn't matter. It's somebody who's really good at managing content.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to touch on any of these external resources in our remaining time? I think there's some highlights here for sure.
Learning pathways.
I think we talked about training and documentation. Don't waste your time documenting and training on stuff that Microsoft is doing for you. Bring it into your environment with learning pathways. Spend your time making a page where there's only something specific to your organization. Spend your time on your special Snowflake scenario and add that to the learning pathways playlist.
Nice.
Yep.
Love our learning pathways.
Writing for the web, Mark posted in the chat the link to that. That is an outstanding course from the Sharing is Caring community. Emily co-presented the first one this week. Really great for a burn-in first rev of it. It's awesome. I think there's something there that everybody can take away. I do this every day and I learn from it. It's really good. Other Microsoft community content, community docs. This is a plug for community docs. Mr. Mark?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of content out there that's on people's blogs, et cetera. The Microsoft community content is content that we as a community write and store centrally. We'd love to have you contribute stuff, but that's some great content that shows how other people are solving problems using this platform.
And the user groups, I think there was some debate about whether this is a valid extra resource for content owners, as opposed to keeping it in-house, using the champions community. I don't see a lot of content owners at user groups being like, hey, I have this question about publishing my content. It's more like we hear from people like yourselves, hey, we have these content owners who are problematic. How do we coach them up? Does anybody have a clear use case for that? User groups as an external resource for content owners?
I think it depends on the topic that's being presented. I know majority of what I talk about, my primary audience is site owners. So I think it really depends who's talking and at what group. If
Okay.
you don't have a champions community at your organization, I highly recommend finding a user group to be involved with, because that's your new option for, hey, has anyone tried to do this? A lot of user groups will have time at the beginning or end for just open discussion, open questions, and that user group leader is going to try and direct you to resources in the community to support your problem as well.
Point.
Thank you. Yep. All right. I know we're at time here. We talked about this example. We put some resources out there as always, some links for you, link to that writing for the web course, the community content, maturity model content, etc. So there's plenty out here, some upcoming live dates, which are approaching faster than ever. And then to Melissa's question and point earlier, our next conversation, assembling a steering committee, who should be on it, what they should be doing, etc. Some best practices there, better practices there. 2 weeks hence, open mailbag. Love to hear from you, your questions. Please submit them. Julie, the mechanism for submitting them is on the web. On our.
No, it's right there on the slide.
Oh, it's right here. Perfect.
Yeah,
on the
you
questions
just click
and
that.
ideas.
It's a little Microsoft form, and we'll review them there.
Yeah, we'd love to hear what's on your mind and ways that we can deliver content that's very, very specific to your needs.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your sticking with us for a little lunchtime or end of the day. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Have a great one. Bye.
Bye.